The snow fell softly on St. Mary Mead, transforming the village into a scene from a Christmas card as the winter charity ball commenced in the assembly rooms. Paper snowflakes danced from the rafters, while evergreen garlands framed tall windows that glowed warmly against the December night. The cream of local society had gathered in their finest evening wear, the gentlemen resplendent in black tie, and the ladies adorned with pearls that caught the chandelier light with every graceful movement. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly near a pillar, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue baby blanket, though her sharp eyes observed far more than her stitches. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, the recently widowed mistress of Ashworth Hall, presided over the evening with practiced grace. Her black silk gown was appropriately somber yet undeniably elegant, and her famous diamond star brooch caught every light as she moved through the crowd accepting condolences. The ball was raising funds for the new children's wing at the local hospital, a cause particularly dear to her heart since losing her own infant son years ago. Miss Marple noted how the widow's composure never wavered, though her eyes held shadows that spoke of more than grief. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, the village solicitor, hovered near Mrs. Ashworth with obvious devotion. His frequent visits to Ashworth Hall since her husband's sudden death 3 months prior had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple observed how his hands trembled whenever other gentlemen approached the widow. Dr. Edmund Carruthers, recently divorced and undeniably handsome, stood in animated conversation with Colonel Bantry, though his gaze frequently strayed to Mrs. Ashworth with unmistakable interest. The tension between the two men was palpable, a rivalry dressed in polite smiles. Near the piano, Miss Lydia Ashworth, the deceased man's spinster sister, played melancholy waltzes with technical precision but little warmth. Her grey dress seemed deliberately plain compared to the other ladies' finery, and her pale eyes held bitter resentment as she watched Victoria accept compliments and sympathy. Miss Marple noticed how Lydia's playing grew more forceful whenever Victoria laughed, the notes striking keys with unnecessary sharpness. Young Timothy Ashworth, Victoria's stepson from her husband's first marriage, moved through the crowd with careless charm that made mothers worry about their daughters. At 25, he possessed the kind of easy confidence that came from privilege, yet Miss Marple observed how his gaiety seemed forced, particularly when he looked toward his stepmother. His hand shook almost imperceptibly when he raised his champagne glass, and she noted he had been declined by several young ladies whose mothers had clearly issued warnings. The evening progressed with the usual village rituals. Mrs. Bantry commanded the punch bowl with benevolent authority, while her husband made dry observations that only she seemed to appreciate. The raffle drew enthusiastic participation, with prizes ranging from hand-stitched quilts to hampers of local produce. Miss Marple's attention was caught by small details others missed: a program card retied in a different knot, holly berries dropping scarlet stains on the white cloth, a pair of gloves tucked hastily under a chair. As the orchestra prepared for another waltz, Mrs. Ashworth moved toward the small podium to announce the evening's charitable auction. Various items donated by local families would be sold to raise additional funds, and she took her position with obvious pleasure, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Timothy positioned himself near the exit, his eyes darting nervously between his stepmother and the other guests. Mr. Hartwell remained at the back of the crowd, his face pale and strained, while Dr. Carruthers stood ready to assist the widow if needed. The first hint of trouble came when old Jameson, Lady Pemberton's butler, approached Miss Marple with obvious distress. He whispered that someone had been tampering with the champagne service in the butler's pantry, though the person had moved away too quickly to be identified. Miss Marple thanked him quietly and made a mental note to observe who might be avoiding the refreshments. Mrs. Ashworth began the auction with a watercolor painted by the vicar's wife, her voice clear and persuasive as she encouraged generous bids. The atmosphere had subtly shifted, though most guests remained oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that Miss Marple sensed as clearly as the approaching storm outside. She noticed Timothy's increasing agitation, Lydia's calculating stare, and the way both Hartwell and Dr. Carruthers watched every gesture of the beautiful widow. As Mrs. Ashworth raised her champagne glass to toast the evening's success, her voice suddenly faltered mid-sentence. The crystal flute slipped from her fingers to shatter on the marble floor, and she swayed dangerously before collapsing in an ungainly heap beside the podium. Dr. Carruthers rushed forward, but his examination was brief and grim. "She's gone," he announced quietly, and the festive atmosphere evaporated like morning mist. Miss Marple, very still in her corner, observed the shocked faces around her and noted that murder had come to St. Mary Mead, disguised as Charity and dressed in evening clothes. The champagne flute's crystalline shatter against marble seemed to echo endlessly through the assembly rooms as Dr. Carruthers's pronouncement settled over the gathering like a funeral shroud. The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by a stunned silence that lasted precisely 3 heartbeats before erupting into chaos. Ladies gasped and clutched their evening bags. Gentlemen moved protectively toward their wives, and the orchestra's abandoned instruments gleamed mutely under the chandeliers. Mrs. Bantry, ever practical in crisis, immediately took command. "Colonel, telephone Inspector Slack at once," she ordered, her authoritative voice cutting through the rising hysteria. "Ladies, please step away from the deceased and allow Dr. Carruthers proper space for his examination." Timothy Ashworth stood frozen beside the overturned refreshment table, his youthful face a mask of bewildered horror that seemed almost theatrical in its intensity. "This cannot be happening," he repeated, running trembling hands through his dark hair. "Victoria was perfectly healthy. She had her medical examination just last week." Miss Marple noted how his voice carried clearly across the room and how several guests exchanged meaningful glances at his oddly specific knowledge of his stepmother's private medical affairs. Young men rarely concerned themselves with such details unless they had particular reasons for knowing them. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell pushed through the crowd with obvious distress, his usual composed demeanor completely shattered. "I should have insisted she see a specialist in London," he muttered, attempting to kneel beside Victoria's body despite Dr. Carruthers's gentle protests. "She mentioned headaches recently, but I attributed it to the strain of adjusting to widowhood." His hands shook as he reached toward the diamond star brooch at her throat, the gesture possessive even in death. Miss Marple observed how his eyes kept darting toward the exit as though calculating escape routes. From her position at the piano, Lydia Ashworth continued playing a funeral dirge, her pale fingers mechanically producing notes that sent chills through the assembled guests. When Mrs. Bantry firmly requested she stop, Lydia's colorless eyes showed no emotion whatsoever. "Victoria always said music should accompany every significant moment," she replied in her thin voice. "I am merely providing appropriate accompaniment for her final performance." The callousness of her words shocked even the most hardened gossips present, and several ladies instinctively moved away from the piano bench. Dr. Carruthers completed his preliminary examination with professional efficiency, though his usual confident manner seemed strained. "Without a proper post-mortem, I cannot determine the exact cause of death," he announced to the expectant crowd. "However, the symptoms suggest possible cardiac arrest, though there is a faint almond scent that concerns me." His medical bag remained conspicuously unopened, and Miss Marple wondered whether his reluctance stemmed from professional caution or personal involvement with the deceased. Inspector Slack arrived within minutes, his perpetually irritated expression suggesting he considered the entire evening a personal inconvenience. "Right then, nobody leaves until I've spoken to each of you individually," he declared, surveying the elegant assembly with obvious disapproval. "Healthy women don't simply drop dead at charity balls without good reason." His blunt manner sent fresh ripples of unease through the crowd and Miss Marple observed how various guests began positioning themselves strategically around the room, some moving closer to exits while others huddled together for moral support. Gossip, that relentless force in village life, began its insidious work almost immediately. "Poison, undoubtedly," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley to her companion, eyes wide with morbid fascination. "Remember that dreadful business in Little Paddocks? Always the quiet ones, you know." Near the punch bowl, Mrs. Clement murmured to the vicar, "Poor Victoria had her detractors, didn't she? Those rumors about changing her husband's will after his sudden passing." The speculation grew bolder as small groups formed, pooling their fragmented observations and fertile imaginations. "It must be the stepson," declared one matron with conviction, glancing toward Timothy. "Always after her money, and she was so strict with the purse strings." Another voice chimed in. "Or perhaps Mr. Hartwell, he was so devoted, almost possessive. Perhaps she spurned his advances." Miss Marple listened to the swirling theories while her knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm. In her experience, murder in small villages rarely stemmed from grand passions or elaborate schemes, but from the accumulated weight of daily irritations and thwarted ambitions. She had observed Timothy's genuine distress, yet noted how his eyes occasionally flickered toward the door as if contemplating escape. Lydia's cool assessment of the scene seemed devoid of real grief, more like a business transaction being evaluated. Mr. Hartwell's devastation appeared profound, but beneath the sorrow lurked something else, a desperate, guilty fear that spoke of secrets yet unrevealed. As Inspector Slack began organizing his investigation, Miss Marple reflected that charity balls, like human nature itself, often concealed the most uncharitable impulses beneath their glittering surfaces. The assembly room settled into an uneasy quiet as Inspector Slack established his makeshift headquarters in the manager's small office, the festive decorations now seeming grotesquely inappropriate against the backdrop of sudden death. Constable Davies positioned himself at the main entrance, his youthful face grave with responsibility, while the remaining guests huddled in small groups, their evening finery wrinkled and their conversations reduced to nervous whispers. Miss Marple remained in her corner chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, though her sharp blue eyes missed nothing of the human drama unfolding around her. She had positioned herself with characteristic foresight near the connecting door, where fragments of conversation would drift to her attentive ears. Inspector Slack, a man whose patience was perpetually tested by village complications, began his questioning with methodical determination. Timothy Ashworth was summoned first, his earlier theatrical horror now replaced by sullen defensiveness. Through the partially open door, Miss Marple heard his voice crack with strain as he attempted to explain his financial arrangements with his stepmother. Victoria controlled the purse strings, yes, but she wasn't unreasonable, he insisted, though his tone suggested recent disagreements had been anything but amicable. Miss Marple observed how his hands trembled when he emerged from the interview, and how he repeatedly smoothed his dark hair in a gesture that spoke of deeper anxiety than mere grief. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell's interview proved more emotionally charged, his professional composure completely shattered. Miss Marple caught fragments of his testimony through the thin walls, particularly his revelation that Victoria had been receiving anonymous letters suggesting she didn't deserve her inheritance. "She was frightened, Inspector," came his broken voice. "Someone had been watching the house at night, and she confided her fears to me as her solicitor." When he emerged, Miss Marple noted how his hand instinctively went to his breast pocket, as though checking for something precious or incriminating, and how his eyes avoided meeting anyone else's gaze. Lydia Ashworth's questioning provided a stark contrast, her responses delivered with glacial precision that chilled even Inspector Slack's professional demeanor. "Victoria and I maintained a purely familial relationship," her thin voice carried clearly. "We disagreed on certain financial matters, but that is hardly grounds for murder." Miss Marple observed Lydia's exit with particular interest, noting how the woman's pale eyes held no grief whatsoever, only a curious satisfaction that suggested years of accumulated resentment finally finding expression. Dr. Carruthers maintained his medical authority during questioning, confirming the bitter almond scent that suggested cyanide poisoning. The champagne would have been the most likely delivery method, he stated with professional certainty. Yet Miss Marple noticed how he meticulously wiped his hands with his handkerchief despite having touched nothing remarkable, and how his gaze kept drifting toward Victoria's diamond star brooch with an intensity that seemed more personal than professional. During a brief recess, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Bantry with apparent casualness, her innocent demeanor encouraging confidences. Poor Victoria seemed quite nervous early in the evening, Mrs. Bantry confided in hushed tones. She kept checking her watch and glancing toward the entrance as though expecting someone specific, most unlike her usual composed manner. This observation aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's own notice of Victoria's frequent glances toward the refreshment table and her specific request for champagne rather than the punch most guests preferred. As Inspector Slack's frustration mounted with each inconclusive interview, Miss Marple quietly catalogued the physical evidence others overlooked. She had noticed someone near the service area during the auction preparations, though the person had moved away too quickly for identification. More intriguingly, she observed that Victoria's program card had been retied with a clumsy granny knot, rather than the neat reef knots used by Mrs. Pike's niece, who had prepared them all with guide precision. Such a small detail spoke volumes about hasty interference by unfamiliar hands. Old Jameson, when questioned about the champagne service, mentioned glimpsing a dark blue sleeve and catching a scent of violets near the bottles. Miss Marple mentally catalogued the evening's dark blue garments, Mrs. Price Ridley's unfortunate satin, the vicar's wife's navy crepe, and Lydia's severely plain gown. Yet Lydia never wore scent, having once declared perfume a snare for women seeking attention. The discrepancy suggested either deliberate misdirection or a more complex deception than appeared on the surface. Near the overturned refreshment table, Miss Marple discovered a pair of white gloves tucked beneath a chair, smudged with fine gray dust and neatly darned at the thumb. The careful mending spoke of someone thrifty and precise, while the gray residue suggested contact with something powdery. She also noted how a holly sprig had been hastily replaced on the podium cloth, leaving an extra puncture mark that spoke of nervous activity rather than careful decoration. As the evening wore on and guests were gradually released after providing their details, Miss Marple reflected on the human elements that would prove more revealing than any physical evidence. Each suspect had demonstrated knowledge of Victoria's recent state of mind that they initially concealed. Timothy's awareness of her medical appointments, Hartwell's intimate knowledge of her fears, Lydia's detailed observations of her unpopularity, and Dr. Carruthers's professional assessment of her stress levels. The pattern suggested a woman living in carefully concealed terror, yet brave enough to maintain public appearances until the very end. Murder in villages, Miss Marple knew, rarely stemmed from grand passions, but from the accumulated weight of daily irritations and thwarted ambitions, dressed in evening clothes and served with champagne. Morning brought a crystalline frost to St. Mary Mead, though the chill in the air seemed less severe than the one that had settled over the village's collective conscience. By the time the milk cart completed its rounds, every household buzzed with theories about the previous evening's tragedy, each more elaborate than the last. Mrs. Price Ridley held court at the post office, declaring with authority born of 3 detective novels that poison was always a woman's weapon, while the baker's wife countered that young men nowadays possessed no moral restraint whatsoever. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had spent a productive morning assembling what he considered an airtight case against Timothy Ashworth. The evidence against the young man appeared overwhelming to minds that preferred their mysteries solved quickly and neatly. Timothy's gambling debts, revealed through inquiries at several London establishments, exceeded his quarterly allowance by nearly £300. His bookmaker in Much Benham had been refreshingly forthcoming about the mounting pressure for payment, and there was talk of threats that had grown increasingly serious. More damaging still were the overheard arguments between stepmother and stepson regarding his allowances, witnessed by the parlour maid who had been dusting the stair railings when voices rose in the morning room. She threatened to cut him off entirely if he didn't reform his ways. Inspector Slack confided to Colonel Bantry over morning tea. The boy was desperate, and desperate men do desperate things. The physical evidence seemed equally conclusive. A small glass vial, bearing traces of potassium cyanide, had been discovered tucked away in an unused overcoat hanging in the assembly room's cloakroom. The coat bore Timothy's initials on the inside label, though he claimed no knowledge of how the vial came to be there. His movements during the crucial period remained frustratingly vague. While several guests recalled seeing him circulating through the crowd, none could provide a specific alibi for the moments immediately preceding Victoria's collapse. Most tellingly, old Jameson had observed a figure in the dark evening clothes near the service area during the auction preparations, moving with the furtive haste of someone engaged in clandestine activity. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly troubled by details that seemed to exonerate rather than condemn the obvious suspect. During her morning constitutional, she encountered Timothy outside the lending library, his youthful face haggard with genuine distress that seemed too profound for mere performance. His questions about legal procedures for contesting arrest suggested someone preparing for a lengthy battle rather than expecting swift resolution through confession. "I know everyone believes me guilty," he told her with bitter honesty, "but Victoria was the closest thing to a mother I'd known since childhood. Our disagreements about money were just that. Disagreements, not grounds for murder." The planted evidence troubled Miss Marple's methodical mind considerably. Timothy, for all his reckless gambling and financial irresponsibility, had never demonstrated the calculating patience required for such elaborate deception. Would a young man desperate enough to commit murder then carelessly leave incriminating evidence in a coat that could easily be traced to him? The timing also seemed problematic. Victoria had raised her glass and collapsed almost immediately, suggesting the poison had been administered directly into her specific drink, rather than into the general champagne supply. This required intimate knowledge of her preferences and a precise timing that spoke of careful observation rather than impulsive action. Meanwhile, the other suspects continued to display behaviors that warranted closer scrutiny than Inspector Slack seemed inclined to provide. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell had immediately requested meetings with Timothy to discuss estate administration, despite the obvious impropriety of such haste. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, collar slightly askew, small scratches on his hands suggesting nervous activity, and his briefcase clutched with white-knuckled intensity. The anonymous letters that had frightened Victoria, discovered in her escritoire, contained intimate knowledge of her daily routines that suggested surveillance by someone familiar with her household patterns. Lydia Ashworth's reaction proved equally revealing in its calculated coldness. She had moved swiftly to reclaim her childhood quarters at Ashworth Hall, ostensibly to comfort Timothy, but actually spending her time methodically searching through Victoria's private correspondence. The servants whispered about finding her reading letters by candlelight at dawn, her expression suggesting discovery rather than grief. Dr. Carruthers, meanwhile, had been treating Victoria for severe anxiety attacks, prescribing increasingly strong sedatives while making unusually frequent house calls during the week preceding the ball. The physical clues that had captured Miss Marple's attention the previous evening continued to nag at her consciousness. The white gloves tucked beneath a chair, smudged with fine grey dust and carefully darned at the thumb, spoke of meticulous hands rather than youthful carelessness. The scent of violets that Jameson had detected near the champagne service didn't correspond to any of the obvious suspects' known preferences. yet it lingered in Miss Marple's memory as significant. Most intriguing was her observation of Victoria's diamond star brooch, with its mechanical catch that could be operated more easily than standard clasps, and Mr. Hartwell's instinctive reach toward it immediately after the collapse. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the frost-touched gardens, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern that suggested multiple motives converging around one vulnerable woman. The village's eagerness to condemn Timothy troubled her sense of justice, particularly when she observed how readily everyone accepted his guilt without examining alternatives. In her experience, the most obvious suspect often proved innocent, while the true culprit remained hidden behind a mask of respectability and false grief, waiting for public attention to focus elsewhere before making their escape from consequences that had been carefully planned and precisely executed. Inspector Slack announced with considerable satisfaction that he would be seeking a warrant for Timothy Ashworth's arrest by evening, his manner suggesting that a tidy solution would restore the village's proper equilibrium. The young man's mounting gambling debts, combined with his stepmother's threats to reduce his allowance, painted a portrait of desperation that satisfied the inspector's preference for straightforward motive. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that seemed to exonerate rather than condemn the obvious suspect. During her morning constitutional, she had observed Timothy's genuine distress outside the lending library. His haggard appearance speaking of grief rather than guilt, and his questions about legal procedures suggesting someone preparing for a lengthy battle rather than expecting swift resolution through confession. The physical evidence that had captured Miss Marple's attention during the charity ball continued to nag at her methodical mind. Armed with her knitting bag and the gentle authority of age, she returned to the assembly rooms under the pretext of retrieving a dropped thimble. Mr. Rudd, the caretaker, admitted her with obvious reluctance, his manner suggesting that murders left stains more persistent than ordinary mishaps. The service area remained undisturbed, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes immediately detected what hasty police searches had overlooked. Wedged beneath the leg of a side table was a small, crumpled wrapper bearing the distinctive purple lettering of Parma violets, its chalky residue leaving telltale gray smears on her fingertips when she carefully extracted it with her umbrella tip. The discovery aligned perfectly with old Jameson's observation about detecting violet scent near the champagne service, and with the fine gray dust she had noticed on the white cotton gloves hidden beneath a chair. Miss Marple, whose extensive experience with the Women's Institute had taught her to observe ladies' preferences with scientific precision, mentally catalogued the village women devoted to those particular chalky confections. Most were absent from the ball, but one had been present in navy crepe and sensible shoes, moving through the crowd with the invisible efficiency of someone accustomed to managing practical details while others enjoyed themselves. Her afternoon visit to Ashworth Hall, ostensibly to offer condolences with a modest bouquet of hellebores, provided opportunities for closer observation of the remaining suspects. Lydia Ashworth received her in the morning room with glacial courtesy, her severe grey dress emphasizing the austere atmosphere of a house where comfort had always been subordinated to discipline. Miss Marple's innocent remarks about the prevalence of violet scents this season prompted Lydia's immediate response that such perfumes were vulgar affectations, yet her pale eyes held a flicker of something that might have been anxiety. Timothy's entrance brought restless energy that contrasted sharply with his aunt's rigid composure. His rumpled appearance and obvious exhaustion spoke of genuine distress, and his casual mention that Victoria had particularly disliked sweets, claiming they gave her nighttime headaches, provided another piece of the emerging puzzle. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the sewing basket beside Lydia's chair, which contained a pair of white cotton gloves with meticulous darning at the thumb and the faintest chalky bloom where they had rested against the workbag's fabric. Ellen, the parlour-maid who brought tea, confirmed Victoria's aversion to confections while praising Lydia's exceptional needlework skills. The girl's red-rimmed eyes spoke of genuine grief, and her instinctive avoidance of Lydia's direct gaze suggested household tensions that extended beyond normal servant relationships. When Miss Marple complimented the neat darning, Ellen's face brightened with professional pride, though she was quick to credit Lydia as the finest needlewoman she had ever observed. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell's arrival during the tea service provided another opportunity for observation. His briefcase was secured with reef knots tied with sailor-like precision, and his nervous habit of checking his inner pocket suggested concealed documents of particular importance. The faint sweetness on his breath carried notes of aniseed rather than violets, and printer's ink stained his cuff in a way that spoke of recent document handling. His overly hearty assurances to Timothy about managing difficulties rang false, particularly when combined with his obvious positioning near Lydia that exceeded social propriety. Dr. Carruthers's later visit, ostensibly to recommend sleeping draughts for the grieving household, revealed another inconsistency when Miss Marple innocently questioned the wisdom of combining champagne with sedatives. His claim that Victoria had requested lemon with her drink contradicted Miss Marple's clear recollection that no lemons had been available at the refreshment table, only sugar and cream for those who preferred their champagne modified. The doctor's quick glance toward both Lydia and Timothy when making this assertion suggested he was seeking corroboration for a fabricated detail. As evening shadows lengthened across the frost-touched gardens, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern of evidence that pointed away from the obvious suspect toward someone with access to household routines, exceptional needlework skills, and the practical knowledge to handle both poisons and their delivery systems. The white cotton gloves spoke of someone accustomed to manual tasks, while the chalky dust suggested regular handling of certain confections that could mask more sinister substances. The careful darning indicated patience and precision, qualities that would serve equally well in planning murder as in mending household linens. The discrepancy between the violet scent detected at the scene and Lydia's known aversion to perfumes suggested either deliberate misdirection or the adoption of unfamiliar habits for a specific purpose. Miss Marple's extensive knowledge of village personalities told her that sudden changes in long-established preferences often indicated deception rather than genuine conversion. As she prepared her evening meal, she contemplated how the most obvious suspects frequently proved innocent, while the true culprit remained hidden behind masks of respectability and false grief, waiting for public attention to focus elsewhere before attempting their escape from carefully planned consequences. Inspector Slack's satisfaction radiated through Ashworth Hall's morning room as he prepared the arrest warrant, his manner suggesting that tidy resolutions restored proper village equilibrium more effectively than prolonged investigations. The household had gathered with the resigned air of people witnessing an inevitable conclusion, though Miss Marple observed how each face revealed different emotions beneath their composed masks. Timothy stood pale and hollow-eyed beside the fireplace, his earlier theatrical despair replaced by numb acceptance, while Lydia maintained her rigid posture in Victoria's former chair, with an expression that might have been grief, but looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Mr. Hartwell hovered near the escritoire with obvious agitation, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain that spoke of sleepless nights spent wrestling with more than professional obligations. The revelation about the cyanide's source had emerged through Miss Marple's gentle inquiries at the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement's flustered explanations about collecting chemicals for the church photographer had inadvertently revealed significant gaps in the poison's chain of custody. The bottle had been signed out from Much Benham's chemist shop twice within 10 days, once legitimately by Mrs. Clement herself, and again by an unknown hand whose clumsy initials suggested either unfamiliarity with formal procedures or deliberate disguise. Mr. Spriggs, the chemist, had been refreshingly forthcoming about the second withdrawal, describing a woman in dark clothing who had presented the vicarage key and claimed urgent need for additional supplies. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to collect her forgotten thimble from the assembly rooms had yielded the crucial discovery of a crumpled Parma violets wrapper wedged beneath a service table, its chalky residue matching the grey dust she had observed on white cotton gloves hidden beneath a chair during the charity ball. The connection between violet scent, chalky sweets, and meticulous needlework painted a portrait of someone with access to both household routines and church supplies, yet the obvious suspect remained frustratingly elusive. Mrs. Clement's innocent admission to consuming such confections regularly seemed too convenient, while her presence in the service corridor during the critical period required careful verification. Lydia Ashworth's behavior continued to provide the most compelling evidence of concealed knowledge, her systematic search through Victoria's private correspondence revealing a purpose that extended beyond grief or curiosity. Ellen, the parlour maid, had whispered to Miss Marple about finding her mistress reading letters by candlelight at dawn, her expression suggesting discovery rather than reminiscence. The white cotton gloves in Lydia's sewing basket, with their characteristic darning at the thumb and faint chalky bloom, matched perfectly with those Miss Marple had observed at the crime scene. Yet proving their significance required delicate maneuvering around village loyalties and family obligations. Mr. Hartwell's increasing desperation manifested in frequent visits to London and hushed telephone conversations that suggested legal complications extending beyond routine estate administration. His briefcase, secured with sailor-precise reef knots, contrasted sharply with the clumsy granny knots that had troubled Miss Marple's orderly mind since discovering the retied program cards. The solicitor's nervous habit of checking his inner pocket had intensified, and Miss Marple suspected he carried documents that could illuminate Victoria's final intentions regarding her substantial inheritance. Timothy's casual mention that his stepmother had been reconsidering certain financial arrangements added another layer to the emerging pattern of motive. The anonymous letters that had frightened Victoria, discovered in her escritoire after her death, contained intimate knowledge of her daily routines that suggested surveillance by someone with regular access to Ashworth Hall. The typing showed characteristics of an older machine with a worn ribbon, and Miss Marple's inquiries had revealed that both the vicarage and the solicitor's office possessed such equipment. More significantly, the letter's tone suggested personal grievance rather than random malice, speaking of undeserved inheritance and fault charity in language that betrayed intimate knowledge of family dynamics and financial arrangements. Dr. Carruthers's medical records, examined with appropriate discretion, revealed his growing concern about Victoria's anxiety attacks and her conviction that someone close to her intended harm. His prescription of increasingly strong sedatives during the weeks preceding her death painted a picture of a woman living in carefully concealed terror, yet brave enough to maintain public appearances until the final moment. The doctor's own behavior had grown increasingly erratic, his frequent house calls exceeding professional necessity, and his obvious fascination with Victoria's diamond star brooch suggesting personal rather than medical interest. As Inspector Slack prepared to formalize Timothy's arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern that pointed away from obvious desperation toward calculated patience and intimate knowledge. The real murderer possessed access to both household routines and church supplies, demonstrated exceptional needlework skills, and maintained the psychological composure necessary to plant evidence while appearing to grieve appropriately. The chalky, residue, violet scent, and carefully orchestrated timing all suggested someone who had observed Victoria's habits with predatory attention while maintaining a facade of family loyalty or professional duty. The physical evidence continued to trouble Miss Marple's methodical mind, particularly the mechanical catch on Victoria's diamond star brooch that could be operated more easily than standard clasps. Someone had reached for it immediately after the collapse, suggesting familiarity with its operation and possible concealment of evidence within its hollow interior. The pattern of clues pointed toward a killer who had used intimate knowledge of village relationships and household dynamics to orchestrate both the murder and its apparent solution, sacrificing innocent parties to protect their own carefully constructed reputation while achieving long-desired financial or social objectives through Victoria's convenient death. The arrest warrant bearing Timothy Ashworth's name lay completed on Inspector Slack's desk when dawn broke over St. Mary Mead, its official seal representing what the inspector considered a satisfactory conclusion to an otherwise troubling case. The young man would be taken into custody within hours, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the neat progression of evidence that pointed so convincingly toward his guilt. Her morning constitutional took her past Ashworth Hall, where she observed Lydia's methodical movements through the morning room windows, the woman's severe efficiency suggesting someone organizing affairs with particular purpose rather than grieving appropriately for her deceased sister-in-law. The development that would shatter Inspector Slack's confidence arrived with Constable Davies, whose usually robust demeanor had been replaced by barely concealed panic as he approached Miss Marple near the village green. Victoria's diamond star brooch, that magnificent heirloom with its distinctive mechanical catch, had vanished from the locked evidence room during the night. The theft was inexplicable, a brazen act carried out under police surveillance that challenged not only the inspector's competence but the entire foundation of his investigation. Who would risk breaking into a police station, and why steal a piece of jewelry that seemed secondary to the murder case itself? Miss Marple's request to examine the assembly rooms once more was granted with Inspector Slack's characteristic impatience, though his shaken confidence made him more amenable to accommodating what he considered harmless elderly curiosity. The morning light streaming through tall windows revealed details that evening shadows had obscured, and her methodical examination of the service area yielded discoveries that fundamentally challenged the official narrative. Wedged beneath a serving table, her umbrella tip dislodged a small brass button bearing the distinctive anchor design of Naval Auxiliary Services, its tarnished surface, suggesting recent loss rather than long abandonment. The button's significance became clearer when Miss Marple recalled Lydia's proud mentions of her late father's Royal Navy service and her own wartime stint as a wren. The anchor design matched buttons from auxiliary uniforms, and Lydia's demonstrated knowledge of seamanship, evident in her precise needlework and household management, explained the expertly tied reef knots that had replaced the original granny knots on Victoria's program card. Such attention to nautical detail suggested someone with ingrained maritime habits who had unconsciously corrected what they perceived as improper technique, revealing their presence through professional competence rather than criminal carelessness. Ellen, the parlour-maid, proved unexpectedly valuable when Miss Marple encountered her at the weekly market, the girl's genuine grief contrasting sharply with the calculated composure displayed by other household members. Her innocent revelation that Miss Lydia had been purchasing patent medicines from London for persistent headaches added another dimension to the emerging pattern, particularly when combined with her discovery of empty Parma Violets boxes in Lydia's waste-paper basket. This contradicted Lydia's frequently expressed disdain for common confections and her claims that sweets aggravated her delicate constitution, suggesting deliberate deception about her personal habits and preferences. The brooch theft took on deeper significance when Mr. Hartwell arrived at the police station in obvious distress, his usual professional composure completely shattered by news of the disappearance. His frantic insistence that the brooch contained more than mere sentimental value, combined with his obvious relief at Timothy's impending arrest, painted a portrait of someone whose own secrets would be protected by convenient scapegoating. Miss Marple observed how his hands trembled when discussing the brooch's mechanical catch, and how his eyes avoided direct contact when explaining its supposed purely decorative function. Dr. Carruthers's reaction to the theft proved equally revealing, his medical detachment notably absent as he questioned Constable Davies about security procedures with an intensity that exceeded professional curiosity. His admission that Victoria had been convinced someone in her immediate circle intended harm, combined with his prescription of increasingly strong sedatives during her final weeks, suggested genuine concern for her psychological welfare. More significantly, his detailed knowledge of the brooch's mechanical operation, demonstrated when he had removed it from Victoria's person, indicated familiarity that extended beyond medical necessity. The pattern of evidence increasingly pointed towards someone with intimate access to household routines, demonstrated nautical knowledge and the psychological composure necessary to maintain appearances while systematically terrorizing their victim. Lydia's position as Victoria's sister-in-law provided perfect cover for observing daily habits, while her wartime service had given her access to both chemicals and practical knowledge necessary for their deployment. Her systematic search through Victoria's correspondence after the murder now seemed focused on locating specific documents that could incriminate her in the campaign of intimidation preceding the actual poisoning. As Inspector Slack prepared to execute Timothy's arrest, despite the complicating theft, Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony that the real murderer had successfully manipulated village prejudices and family dynamics to achieve both Victoria's death and the convenient elimination of her primary heir. The planted evidence, carefully orchestrated timing, and immediate focus on gambling debts all suggested a mind capable of long-term planning and ruthless execution. The brass button, Parma Violet's evidence, and distinctive needlework pointed towards someone who had used their position of trust and family loyalty to commit what they believed would be the perfect crime, sacrificing an innocent young man to protect their own carefully constructed facade of respectability and grief, while securing the inheritance they felt was rightfully theirs. The theft of Victoria's diamond star brooch had transformed Inspector Slack's methodical investigation into something far more urgent and complex, his usual confidence replaced by the frustrated energy of a man whose carefully constructed case was unraveling with each passing hour. Miss Marple, however, viewed the brazen theft not as a complication, but as confirmation of her growing suspicions, recognizing that desperate criminals often revealed themselves through increasingly reckless actions when their carefully orchestrated plans began to crumble under scrutiny. The brooch's disappearance suggested it contained evidence that someone was willing to risk everything to conceal, transforming what appeared to be mere jewelry into the key that would unlock the entire mystery surrounding Victoria's calculated murder. Her morning constitutional took her past Hartwell and Smythe, solicitors, where she discovered an unusual commotion that would further complicate the investigation. A small fire had broken out in the early hours, apparently originating in the file storage room where estate documents were kept under lock and key. While the damage was limited, Inspector Slack's examination revealed that specific files had been deliberately targeted, particularly those relating to the Ashworth estate and recent codicil preparations. Most significantly, the fire had been started using materials that bore the distinctive scent of Parma violets, and the door had been secured with string tied in precise reef knots that spoke of maritime training rather than amateur desperation. Mr. Hartwell's obvious distress extended beyond mere professional inconvenience, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain that suggested deeper involvement than he cared to admit. His nervous habit of checking his inner pocket had intensified, and Miss Marple observed how his hands trembled when discussing the missing documents with obvious relief rather than genuine concern. The revelation of his substantial gambling debts, discovered through discreet inquiries at the post office, cast his devotion to Victoria in an entirely different light, suggesting financial desperation rather than romantic attachment as the driving force behind his frequent visits to Ashworth Hall. Ellen's tearful confession during a chance encounter outside the lending library provided crucial emotional context that transformed scattered observations into coherent narrative. The parlor maid revealed that Victoria had been receiving anonymous letters for months, each more threatening than the last, and that she had confided her growing conviction that someone within her immediate circle intended her serious harm. More significantly, Ellen had observed Lydia systematically searching through Victoria's private correspondence after the murder, her expression suggesting successful discovery rather than grief-stricken reminiscence, as she located and methodically destroyed specific documents with practiced efficiency. The pattern of evidence increasingly pointed towards someone with intimate access to household routines, demonstrated nautical knowledge from wartime service, and the psychological composure necessary to maintain appropriate appearances while systematically terrorizing their intended victim. Lydia's position as Victoria's sister-in-law provided perfect cover for observing daily habits and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, while her documented service as a wren had given her access to both chemical knowledge and practical experience with their effective deployment. Her systematic organization of household affairs after the murder now appeared calculated to eliminate incriminating evidence while maintaining the facade of appropriate family mourning. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Ashworth Hall, ostensibly to offer belated condolences with a modest bouquet of winter hellebores, provided opportunities for closer psychological observation of the remaining suspects under less formal circumstances. She arranged the gathering with characteristic subtlety, ensuring that Timothy, Lydia, Mr. Hartwell, and Dr. Carruthers would all be present for what appeared to be innocent social interaction, but was actually her final, decisive test of their individual reactions to carefully chosen provocations. Her seemingly casual conversation about wartime experiences and the distinctive skills learned during naval service prompted immediate tension in Lydia's rigid posture, particularly when Miss Marple mentioned how reef knots could reveal so much about a person's character and background. The observation about Parma violets and their distinctive lingering fragrance caused an almost imperceptible tightening around Lydia's pale eyes, while Timothy's innocent confirmation that Victoria had particularly disliked such confections added another crucial piece to the emerging psychological puzzle. Dr. Carruthers's behavior continued to suggest involvement beyond mere professional duty, his detailed knowledge of the brooch's mechanical operation indicating familiarity that extended well past medical necessity. His nervous checking of inner pockets and increasingly erratic demeanor painted a portrait of someone whose own secrets were threatened by the investigation's evolving direction. Yet his genuine medical concern for Victoria's psychological state suggested collaboration rather than primary responsibility for her systematic terrorization. The physical evidence that had initially seemed to condemn Timothy now appeared carefully orchestrated to deflect suspicion from the real perpetrator through manipulation of village prejudices and family dynamics. The planted glass vial in his overcoat, the conveniently overheard arguments about financial allowances, and the immediate focus on gambling debts all suggested deception by someone with intimate knowledge of household relationships and community expectations. Miss Marple recognized the cruel pattern of a killer who had used their position of trust and apparent respectability to commit what they believed would be the perfect crime, sacrificing an innocent young man to achieve their own long-desired financial objectives while maintaining their carefully constructed facade of grief and family loyalty. As evening shadows lengthened across the frost-touched gardens and Inspector Slack prepared to formalize Timothy's arrest despite the complicating theft, Miss Marple reflected on the psychological ruthlessness required to destroy both victim and scapegoat in pursuit of what the killer considered rightful inheritance. The real murderer possessed not only the means and opportunity, but the calculating patience necessary to orchestrate such elaborate deception, using their knowledge of human nature and village dynamics to create a web of false evidence that had nearly succeeded in its devastating efficiency. The morning room at Ashworth Hall had been transformed into what Miss Marple privately considered her most delicate psychological laboratory, each piece of furniture positioned with seemingly casual precision to encourage natural conversation while allowing her to observe every subtle reaction from her corner chair. She had requested this gathering under the gentle pretext of discussing memorial arrangements for Victoria and the proper distribution of charitable funds, though her true purpose involved setting a carefully baited trap that would compel the real murderer to reveal themselves through instinctive behavior rather than calculated deception. The stolen diamond star brooch had provided the final catalyst she needed, transforming what appeared to be mere jewelry theft into desperate evidence of guilt that could no longer be concealed through careful planning. Timothy arrived first, his youthful face hollow with exhaustion and his impending arrest lending desperate urgency to every movement, while Lydia maintained her characteristic rigid composure in Victoria's former chair with an expression that suggested satisfaction rather than appropriate grief. Inspector Slack had reluctantly agreed to observe from the adjacent conservatory, his professional skepticism warring with grudging respect for Miss Marple's previous successes in matters that had confounded official investigation. Mr. Hartwell entered with obvious reluctance, his briefcase secured with those tellingly precise reef knots that had first captured Miss Marple's attention, while Dr. Carruthers positioned himself near the tea service with nervous agitation that spoke of secrets weighing heavily on his professional conscience. Miss Marple began her psychological game with characteristic gentleness, her knitting needles clicking softly as she poured tea and offered innocent observations about village life and the resilience of community bonds during difficult times. Her seemingly casual mention of the recent fire at Hartwell and Smythe prompted immediate tension, particularly when she remarked upon the distinctive floral scent that had puzzled the fire brigade and the precision of the nautical knots used to secure the door. Such interesting details, she mused, her blue eyes twinkling with apparent innocence, particularly when one considers how professional training leaves such indelible marks on our unconscious habits. Wouldn't you agree, Miss Ashworth? Lydia's response carried the sharp edge of someone whose composure was being systematically tested, her pale eyes flickering with something that might have been anxiety as she acknowledged her wartime service with the Wrens and her father's naval career. Miss Marple's gentle praise for the precision of reef knots and their revelation of character prompted an almost imperceptible tightening around Lydia's mouth, while Timothy's innocent confirmation that Victoria had particularly disliked Parma violets, claiming they gave her nighttime headaches, added another carefully placed piece to the psychological puzzle that was slowly tightening around the real murderer. The conversation drifted naturally to the missing brooch, and Miss Marple's expression of concern about its theft from the police station produced the reactions she had anticipated from guilty consciences. Dr. Carruthers's immediate defensive response revealed intimate familiarity with the brooch's mechanism that extended well beyond medical necessity, while Mr. Hartwell's obvious relief at the evidence's disappearance suggested personal involvement in its concealment. Miss Marple's casual observation that clever little compartments in antique jewelry had often served ladies as private banks before modern institutions became agreeable prompted visible tension in several faces, particularly when she mentioned how such hiding places could conceal important papers or personal mementos. Ellen served refreshments with red-rimmed eyes that spoke of genuine grief, her instinctive avoidance of direct contact with Lydia now appearing more significant than mere servant discretion. Miss Marple's gentle inquiry about Victoria's recent state of mind prompted the parlour-maid's tearful confirmation that her mistress had been receiving threatening letters for months, each more menacing than the last, and that she had confided her growing conviction that someone within her immediate circle intended serious harm. The revelation that these letters contained intimate knowledge of household routines and personal habits suggested authorship by someone with regular access to Ashworth Hall and deep familiarity with its occupants' daily patterns. The psychological trap reached its crucial moment when Miss Marple produced a substitute brooch borrowed from Mrs. Bantry, apologizing for her clumsiness with mechanical catches and requesting demonstration of the proper technique for opening such delicate mechanisms. Timothy confessed he had never touched Victoria's jewelry, while Mr. Hartwell hesitated nervously, and Dr. Carruthers offered general observations about antique craftsmanship. Lydia, however, reached forward with unconscious confidence and pressed not the obvious clasp, but a tiny star point, sliding the center plate with practiced precision that revealed intimate familiarity gained through repeated handling rather than casual observation. The small gesture spoke volumes to Miss Marple's trained eye, confirming her suspicions about who had possessed both opportunity and knowledge to conceal evidence within the brooch's hollow interior. Lydia's immediate realization of her mistake was evident in the sudden rigidity of her posture, though she attempted to maintain composure through sheer force of will. Miss Marple's gentle observation that the police had discovered impressions of folded paper within the stolen brooch's compartment prompted visible tremors in hands that had remained steady throughout months of careful deception and systematic terrorization. The confession, when it came, emerged not through dramatic outburst, but through the gradual crumbling of a facade that could no longer sustain itself under psychological pressure. Lydia's admission began as bitter justification for her actions, speaking of years of resentment toward Victoria's control over family finances and her transformation of Timothy into what she considered a wastrel dependent upon charity. The anonymous letters had been intended merely to frighten Victoria into reconsidering certain financial arrangements, but when gentle terrorization failed to achieve desired results, more decisive action became necessary to reclaim what she considered rightfully hers as the last true Ashworth. As Inspector Slack emerged from his concealment to formalize the arrest, Miss Marple reflected sadly on the psychological ruthlessness required to destroy not only an intended victim, but also carefully chosen scapegoats in pursuit of inheritance and social position. Lydia Ashworth had used her position of trust and apparent respectability to orchestrate systematic terror followed by perfectly timed murder, manipulating village prejudices and family dynamics to create elaborate deception that had nearly succeeded through exploitation of human weakness and community expectations, leaving destruction in its wake while maintaining the facade of grief and family loyalty until the very end. The morning room at Ashworth Hall had transformed into Miss Marple's most delicate psychological laboratory, each piece of furniture positioned with seemingly casual precision while she observed every subtle reaction from her corner chair. Inspector Slack watched from the conservatory doorway, his professional skepticism warring with grudging respect for her previous successes in matters that had confounded official investigation. The stolen diamond star brooch had provided the final catalyst she needed, transforming apparent jewelry theft into desperate evidence that could no longer be concealed through careful planning. Miss Marple began her revelation with characteristic gentleness, her knitting needles clicking softly as she poured tea and offered innocent observations about the resilience of community bonds during difficult times. Her seemingly casual mention of the recent fire at Hartwell and Smythe prompted immediate tension, particularly when she remarked upon the distinctive floral scent that had puzzled the fire brigade and the precision of nautical knots used to secure the door. Such interesting details, she mused, her blue eyes twinkling with apparent innocence, particularly when one considers how professional training leaves such indelible marks on our unconscious habits. The conversation drifted naturally to physical evidence that others had overlooked. The scent of violets, so agreeable on handkerchiefs, yet so out of place near champagne service. Old Jameson had detected Parma violets by the bottles. She had discovered a crumpled wrapper beneath the service table. White cotton gloves tucked under chairs bore that telltale gray bloom of chalk. Parma violets disguise disagreeable odors, Miss Marple explained gently, and cyanide is notorious for its bitter almond scent. A practical woman might dust the rim of one particular glass, ensuring the chosen victim received precisely what was intended. Her attention turned to the holly sprig on the podium cloth, with its 2 neat holes where one should suffice, the extra puncture revealing hasty replacement after nervous activity. Someone had marked Victoria's specific glass with botanical precision, ensuring no innocent person would suffer, regardless of who carried the serving tray. The reef knots that secured various items throughout the evening spoke of maritime training, unconscious excellence that revealed wartime service with the wrens and naval heritage that left indelible marks on domestic habits. Miss Marple's gentle praise for needlework precision prompted visible tension in Lydia Ashworth's rigid posture, particularly when combined with Timothy's innocent confirmation that Victoria had particularly disliked confections, claiming they caused nighttime headaches. The small brass button-bearing anchor insignia, discovered near service tables after careful searching, belonged to auxiliary uniforms kept for sentimental reasons, mended with characteristic precision, handled often enough to work loose during nervous activity. The psychological trap reached its crucial moment when Miss Marple produced Mrs. Bantry's substitute brooch, apologizing for her clumsiness with mechanical catches and requesting demonstration of proper technique. Lydia reached forward with unconscious confidence, pressing not the obvious clasp but a tiny star point, sliding the center plate with practiced precision that revealed intimate familiarity gained through repeated handling rather than casual observation. Her immediate realization of the mistake was evident in sudden rigidity, though she attempted maintaining composure through sheer force of will. The confession emerged gradually, beginning as bitter justification for years of resentment toward Victoria's control over family finances and her transformation of Timothy into what Lydia considered a wastrel dependent upon charity. The anonymous letters had been intended merely to frighten Victoria into reconsidering certain financial arrangements, but when gentle terrorization failed to achieve desired results, more decisive action became necessary to reclaim what she considered rightfully hers as the last true Ashworth. Mr. Hartwell's trembling hands produced a singed envelope from his inner pocket, containing Victoria's codicil dated 1 week before the ball. The document revealed generous provisions for Lydia, provided she remained at Ashworth Hall assisting Timothy, ironically securing the very financial future she had murdered to obtain. His own gambling debts had made him vulnerable to manipulation, though his relief at Timothy's near arrest stemmed from fear of exposure rather than complicity in murder. Dr. Carruthers confirmed Victoria's increasing paranoia about household threats, his prescription of stronger sedatives reflecting genuine concern rather than criminal involvement. His knowledge of the brooch mechanism came from medical necessity during anxiety attacks, when he had loosened it to help her breathe, never suspecting it would become evidence concealment. As Inspector Slack formalized Lydia's arrest, Timothy's relief at exoneration was quickly replaced by profound grief for his stepmother and bewildered sorrow at his aunt's betrayal. Ellen's tears spoke of genuine loss, while the village grappled with uncomfortable truth about their readiness to condemn innocence while respectability masked calculated evil. Miss Marple packed her knitting thoughtfully, reflecting that human nature changed very little with fashions, even at charity balls lit by chandeliers and good intentions. The most obvious suspects often proved innocent, while true culprits remained hidden behind masks of respectability and false grief, using intimate knowledge of human weakness to orchestrate elaborate deceptions that nearly succeeded through exploitation of community prejudices and family dynamics, leaving destruction in their wake until patient observation and gentle persistence revealed the terrible truth beneath carefully constructed facades. The morning room at Ashworth Hall felt hollow despite its familiar furnishings, the silence following Lydia Ashworth's arrest settling over the household like dust after a storm. Timothy stood by the fireplace, where he had so often faced his stepmother's gentle reproaches about his expenses, his relief at exoneration now overshadowed by profound grief and bewildered betrayal. The woman who had raised him after his father's remarriage, who had taught him to tie proper knots and maintain household accounts, had systematically terrorized Victoria while preparing to sacrifice him for a crime she had meticulously planned. The weight of Ashworth Hall and its secrets now rested entirely on his young shoulders, a responsibility he had never sought but could no longer avoid. Inspector Slack's grudging acknowledgement of Miss Marple's superior deductive abilities was delivered with characteristic reluctance, though his professional integrity compelled recognition that village murders often defied official methodology. The The stolen brooch, recovered from Lydia's attic hiding place among lavender sachets, had contained fragments of her own threatening letters, torn and folded for concealment, but bearing her distinctive handwriting and intimate knowledge of Victoria's daily fears. The violet scent that had puzzled investigators now made perfect sense, masking the bitter almond odor of cyanide while providing false clues about the perpetrator's identity. The village's reaction to these revelations reflected uncomfortable truths about their own readiness to condemn innocence, while respectability masked calculated evil. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had declared Timothy's guilt with such conviction, now claimed she had always sensed something peculiar about Lydia's coldness, while the baker's wife recalled instances of unnatural composure during family crises. Their collective eagerness to accept obvious explanations had nearly enabled the perfect crime, a sobering recognition that familiar faces might harbor unimaginable darkness beneath charitable facades. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell's professional reputation, though not entirely destroyed, had suffered irreparable damage through exposure of his gambling debts and moral compromise. His devotion to Victoria now appeared less romantic than opportunistic, his relief at Timothy's near arrest stemming from fear of financial exposure rather than genuine belief in the young man's guilt. The fire at his office, Lydia's desperate attempt to destroy evidence of their arrangements, had been secured with her characteristic reef knots, providing additional proof of guilt through unconscious maritime precision. Dr. Carruthers found vindication in the revelation that his medical concerns had been genuine, his prescriptions of sedatives representing appropriate responses to legitimate anxiety rather than criminal complicity. Yet the memory of Victoria's terror, her growing conviction that someone within her immediate circle intended harm, would haunt his future practice. His familiarity with the brooch's mechanism, which had seemed suspicious, had actually resulted from medical necessity during anxiety attacks when he had loosened it to help her breathe. Ellen received modest provision under Victoria's codicil, enough for advanced training at a respectable hotel in Much Benham. Her tearful gratitude to Miss Marple was accompanied by firm resolve to abandon chalky sweets forever, the association with her mistress's murder having destroyed any pleasure in Parma violets. The parlor maid's genuine grief contrasted sharply with Lydia's calculated composure, reminding everyone that true affection had existed within the household despite its ultimate corruption. The assembly rooms, still decorated for the winter charity ball, seemed grotesquely inappropriate as the scene of such calculated murder. The committee debated whether to continue the annual tradition, eventually deciding that Victoria's memory deserved commemoration through continued charitable work rather than fearful abandonment of community gatherings. Mrs. Bantry suggested decanting champagne in the kitchen to avoid future complications, a practical precaution that acknowledged how easily domestic routines could conceal deadly intentions. Timothy's transformation from suspected murderer to grief-stricken heir proceeded gradually, his youthful irresponsibility tempered by harsh lessons about trust and family loyalty. He sold his Bentley to address gambling debts, approaching his stepmother's financial advisors with newfound humility and determination to honor her memory through responsible stewardship. The home farm would be modernized with electric equipment and scientific methods, providing steady employment for village families while generating income for charitable purposes Victoria had supported. As Miss Marple prepared her departure, she reflected on the human capacity for self-deception and the dangerous assumptions that allowed calculated predators to operate within communities proud of knowing their neighbors well. Lydia's crime had succeeded through exploitation of village prejudices and family dynamics, using her reputation for moral rectitude and wartime service to deflect suspicion while systematically destroying both victim and intended scapegoat. The anonymous letters had escalated from vague threats to specific menaces, each containing intimate knowledge that could only have come from someone with regular household access. The pattern of evidence that had initially seemed to condemn Timothy now appeared carefully orchestrated to exploit obvious motives and community expectations. The planted glass vial conveniently overheard arguments about allowances, and immediate focus on gambling debts had created a web of false evidence that nearly achieved its devastating purpose. Miss Marple's attention to small details, reef knots replacing granny knots, chalky residue on cotton gloves, holly sprigs repositioned with nervous precision, had revealed the unconscious habits that betrayed calculated deception. Evening shadows lengthened across frost-touched gardens as Miss Marple packed her knitting bag, adding the Parma Violet's wrapper to a collection of domestic trifles that had once unmasked wickedness. Evil rarely announced itself with dramatic flourishes, she reflected, but crept through scullery doors bearing parish contributions and charitable smiles. It departed the same way unless someone noticed that holly had been moved and knots tied properly where they should have been wrong. The village would sleep more peacefully, knowing that patient observation and gentle persistence could still triumph over elaborate deception, though the comfortable certainty of knowing one's neighbors had been forever shaken by the realization that respectability and murder could coexist behind the same familiar face. The frost that had settled over St. Mary Mead following Victoria Ashworth's murder began its gradual retreat as winter yielded to early spring, though the chill that had penetrated the village's collective conscience would require considerably more time to dissipate completely. The inquest concluded with swift efficiency, the coroner's measured pronouncement that Victoria had died of cyanide poisoning, administered with malicious intent, bringing formal closure to proceedings that had shaken the community's fundamental assumptions about respectability and trust. Lydia Ashworth, pale and rigid in the dock, maintained her characteristic composure even as the clerk read the charges, though several observers noted an almost imperceptible flinch when the words, "with malice aforethought," echoed through the courtroom. Inspector Slack departed with his professional dignity and tact, if somewhat chastened, his grudging acknowledgment of Miss Marple's superior deductive abilities, delivered with characteristic reluctance yet genuine respect for her patient methodology. The stolen diamond star brooch, recovered from Lydia's attic hiding place among carefully preserved lavender sachets, had yielded its final secrets, fragments of her own threatening letters, torn and folded for concealment, but bearing distinctive handwriting that revealed intimate knowledge of Victoria's deepest fears and daily vulnerabilities. Timothy Ashworth's transformation from suspected murderer to grief-stricken heir proceeded with remarkable grace, his youthful irresponsibility tempered by harsh lessons about trust and family loyalty that no amount of formal education could have provided. The great house began showing signs of his determined efforts to honor Victoria's memory through responsible stewardship, the morning room now serving as his study, where he pored over estate accounts with newfound maturity. He sold his beloved Bentley without complaint to address gambling debts, approaching Victoria's financial advisors with humility that impressed even the most skeptical observers. The home farm became his particular project, modernized with electric equipment and scientific methods that provided steady employment for village families while generating income for the charitable causes Victoria had supported throughout her brief but generous tenure. The diamond star brooch itself, once emptied of its damning contents, was declined by Timothy with respectful dignity and sold quietly to endow a yearly scholarship for village girls training as nurses. The transformation of Victoria's private badge of pride into a public lantern for futures represented the kind of poetic justice that even Lydia, had she possessed capacity for genuine regret, might have appreciated for its neat accounting. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell's professional reputation, though not entirely destroyed, suffered irreparable damage through exposure of his gambling debts and moral compromise during the crisis. The small fire at his office, Lydia's desperate attempt to destroy evidence of their financial arrangements, had been secured with her characteristic reef knots, providing additional proof of guilt through unconscious maritime precision that revealed wartime training even under extreme stress. He eventually sold his partnership and relocated to a modest coastal practice, forever haunted by memories of how fear had compromised his professional judgment. Dr. Carruthers found vindication in revelations that his medical concerns had been entirely genuine, his prescriptions of increasingly strong sedatives representing appropriate responses to legitimate anxiety rather than criminal complicity. Yet Victoria's growing terror, her conviction that someone within her immediate circle intended serious harm, would haunt his future practice and remind him that village doctors often served as repositories for secrets too dangerous to share with family members. Ellen received modest provision under Victoria's codicil, enough for advanced training at a respectable hotel in Much Benham, her tearful gratitude accompanied by firm resolve to abandon chalky sweets forever. The assembly rooms underwent their own quiet absolution, holly sprigs replaced with prim hyacinths, while the chandelier was lowered and polished until it regained innocent sparkle. After considerable committee debate, they decided Victoria's memory deserved commemoration through continued charitable work rather than fearful abandonment of community traditions. The Winter Charity Ball would continue annually, bearing Victoria's name on a brass plaque, with champagne now decanted safely in the kitchen by paired attendants, a practical precaution acknowledging how easily domestic routines could conceal deadly intentions. The village's collective processing of their misjudgment proceeded with characteristic English reserve, conversations at the post office carrying undertones of uncomfortable self-reflection about their eagerness to condemn innocence while respectability masked calculated evil. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had declared Timothy's guilt with such conviction, now claimed she had always sensed something peculiar about Lydia's unnatural composure, while others quietly acknowledged their dangerous assumptions about knowing neighbors well. Miss Marple, observing these shifts from her cottage window, reflected on the enduring complexities of human nature with the wisdom of long experience. Evil rarely announced itself with dramatic flourishes, she mused, but crept through scullery doors bearing parish contributions and charitable smiles, departing the same way unless someone noticed that holly had been moved and knots tied properly where they should have been wrong. Her attention to small details, reef knots replacing granny knots, chalky residue on cotton gloves, holly sprigs repositioned with nervous precision, had revealed the unconscious habits that betrayed even the most carefully constructed deception. As evening shadows lengthened and Miss Marple completed the pale blue baby blanket begun during that fateful charity ball, she reflected that human nature resembled knitting itself. Mostly plain stitches with occasional complications, requiring patience to identify dropped threads before the whole pattern unraveled. The village would remember this winter's events for a season or two, then gradually focus on new concerns, bumper gooseberry crops, choir boys' cracked notes, the year the river froze completely. Murder had arrived with chandeliers and crushed ice, departing through common sense and patient observation of one small wrapper bearing traces of chalky sweets. St. Mary Mead would sleep more peacefully knowing that gentle persistence could still triumph over elaborate deception, though the comfortable certainty of neighborly innocence had been forever altered by recognition that respectability and murder could coexist behind familiar faces, hidden beneath years of family loyalty until desperate circumstances revealed terrible truths that patience and careful observation could ultimately expose.